The date was April 4th, 1945. The time was just past 7 in the morning. A pale, cold light pressed through the bare trees of central Germany, and the air carried the faint smell of wood smoke drifting from the town of Ohrdruf to the south. Spring had technically arrived, but the ground in Thuringia was still stubborn and half-frozen, crumbling at the edges where boots broke through a thin crust of overnight frost. The town itself looked like dozens of other German towns the men of the 89th Infantry Division had passed through in the previous weeks. Church steeple visible above the rooftops, shuttered windows, the hollow quiet of a place caught between surrender and stubborn resistance. A few civilians had appeared in doorways, then disappeared. Fighter planes had swept low over American positions earlier that morning, strafing in long, deliberate runs, a last effort by the retreating Luftwaffe to slow what could no longer be slowed. The men of the 89th had pressed into their covered positions, listened to the thunder subside, and then resumed their patrol south. The war in Europe was visibly, unmistakably ending. They knew it. They could feel it in the way the German lines crumbled, in the way prisoners surrendered faster, in the way the countryside sat in eerie suspension, waiting. What none of them knew, what no American soldier on the face of the earth yet knew, was what was waiting for them behind the wire fence that was about to appear through the trees less than a mile ahead. Joseph Simbley Jr., 20 years old, from Scranton, Pennsylvania, walked with his squad through the thicket of pine and frozen brush south of the town. He was young enough that the war had swallowed most of what might have been his adolescence, old enough that he had spent the past year dodging artillery on the Moselle River, crossing the Rhine under fire, and losing his closest friend on the first day of combat. He was not a boy who frightened easily anymore. He had seen dead men. He had been close enough to shells to feel the concussion in his chest before he heard the sound. Simbley was an infantryman in the deepest sense, methodical, composed, trained to absorb and proceed. His unit had received conflicting reports in the preceding days about a possible Nazi camp somewhere in this stretch of Thuringia. The reports were vague. Rumors had circulated throughout the Third Army for months about places the Germans had built, places where people were kept, where things happened that nobody described in specific terms. But no American unit had yet found one. Not one man who walked south that morning had any fixed image in his mind of what a concentration camp actually was. They were moving toward an abstraction. Within the hour, it would be the most concrete thing any of them had ever encountered in their lives. Ohrdruf had been established in November 1944, just 5 months earlier, on direct orders from the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office. It was codenamed SII, and its purpose was coldly logistical. Supply forced labor to construct a communications tunnel network beneath Mulberg Castle, near the town center, that would serve as a potential emergency relay for Hitler's command headquarters in the event Berlin was overrun. Local German civilians handled the dynamiting. Prisoners did everything else, digging through rock with their bare hands, hauling debris, working without protective equipment in collapsing tunnels, in the dark, in all weather, fed near-starvation rations. The communication center was never finished. The project was abandoned as Allied forces pushed east. But the camp itself remained, and by March 1945, it held over 11,700 prisoners. French, Belgian, Polish, Czech, Hungarian, Latvian, Russian, Ukrainian, Italian, Yugoslav, German political prisoners, men classified by the Nazis as asocial, homosexuals, and Jews. 11,700 human beings packed into a labor camp in a valley in central Germany while the world outside moved on, fighting its war, debating its politics, printing its newspapers, going about the business of a world that had officially not yet seen what was being done inside these fences. These men had broken no laws that existed in any legitimate legal system on earth. They were there because of what they believed, or where they were born, or whom they loved. They were unarmed, unwilling, unprotected by any treaty or convention that the SS had the slightest intention of honoring. They were workers until they couldn't work, and after that they were a problem to be solved. The SS began solving the problem 10 days before American forces arrived. In late March, as the sound of American artillery reached Thuringia with increasing clarity, the camp's SS administration issued orders to evacuate. Nearly 10,000 prisoners who could still walk were assembled and marched north toward Buchenwald, 30 miles away. The march was not a transfer. It was a killing mechanism with extra steps. Prisoners who fell were shot where they fell. Those who slowed were clubbed, and if they didn't rise, shot. The SS guards who ran that march were not confused about what they were doing, and they were not acting on ambiguous orders. They were professionals in the German state security apparatus who had administered this camp from its first day, who knew exactly what the Geneva Convention said, who knew exactly what the laws of war required, and who proceeded in deliberate, systematic violation of every one of those protections. The march was not an act of war. The prisoners on it were not combatants. They were starving men in striped uniforms who had been worked to near death in a tunnel project that no longer existed, and they were being shot along country roads so that the evidence of their imprisonment might not survive to greet the men now closing from the west. Those too ill or broken to make the march at all never left the camp. The SS shot them in place. When the evacuation was complete, a small detail of guards remained behind with orders to destroy what evidence they could. They dragged bodies to a pit a mile from the camp perimeter. They stacked others on a crude cremation pyre constructed from 60-centimeter railway tracks laid across brick foundations, doused them with pitch, and set them alight. The fire was not thorough. The SS abandoned the effort before it was finished. It is possible they heard the American advance getting close, and they left. They simply walked away and left everything where it was. The charred bones, the half-burned torsos, the mass graves with hands and feet still visible above the soil. The shed where prisoners had been beaten with brass knuckles and shovel handles as routine punishment. The decomposing remains of hundreds of men that no fire had touched, stacked in rooms and lying in open ground, sprinkled with lime not to destroy them, but only to dull the smell. That smell is what reached Joseph Simbly first. Before he saw a single thing, before the fence line appeared through the trees, the air changed. Rotting flesh, burned feces, stale urine, and something chemical underneath it all. It hit him like a wall. His stomach lurched. His legs, which had stopped trembling at artillery a long time ago, buckled once. He did not vomit. He did not turn around. He kept walking through the 15-foot wire fence that surrounded the camp perimeter and into the assembly ground beyond. What he saw there, he would spend the next 76 years trying to find words for. Bloodied, emaciated bodies and tattered striped clothing lay in heaps in the open ground, some still warm. A hand reached upward from a mound of the dead, the hand of an older man with a gaping wound to the skull, as though even in death he was trying to be seen. The pyre of railway ties held charred human remains, skulls, ribs, the geometry of people reduced to ash and bone. Common pits broke the surface of the earth in irregular shapes, torsos and limbs projecting from the soil where the SS had not managed to bury them properly in their haste to be gone. In a wooden shed at the edge of the assembly ground, roughly 30 naked, emaciated bodies had been stacked and sprinkled with lime. The shed had a name among the prisoners who had survived to tell the Americans. They called it the beating shed. 115 strokes, with a sharp-bladed shovel, was the standard punishment for a minor infraction. The brass knuckles used in the shed were still there, on a wooden shelf, exactly where the guards had left them. These stories are told because they must be told, because the men who lived them and the men who died in them deserve to have their names in the record and their truth in the light. If you've watched this far and you believe that matters, consider staying with this channel. Every story here is documented, researched, and told with the respect these people are owed. Now, back to Ohrdruf. The soldiers of the 89th moved through the camp in a state that Simbly later described as a kind of frozen incomprehension, a paralysis of the mind that was not fear and was not grief but was something prior to both, a failure of every reference point he had ever been given for what human beings were capable of. Alongside them, a handful of survivors emerged, men who had hidden in the camp during the evacuation, who had crawled into spaces the SS hadn't searched, who had survived the days between the guards' departure and the Americans' arrival in a state of near-total collapse. These men were walking skeletons. Their eyes were sunken into their faces. They could barely stand. One of them, a Polish prisoner whose name Simbly did not record, but whose face he described remembering with complete clarity for the rest of his life, offered to show the American soldiers where the worst of what had happened had taken place. As he walked and talked, tears came to his eyes, and he fought them down. By 0800 on the morning of April 4th, the first reports were moving up the chain of command of the 3rd United States Army. A company commander filed an initial field report describing the location and general nature of what his men had found. By mid-morning, regimental headquarters had received a fuller account. By noon, the report had reached corps level, and by mid-afternoon on April 4th, it was on the desk of 3rd Army staff officers working under General George S. Patton. The language in the report was precise and controlled, as military reports are written, but the facts it contained were not controllable. A Nazi forced labor subcamp, hundreds of unburied dead, evidence of systematic execution of prisoners prior to evacuation, evidence of cremation attempts, survivor testimony describing torture, starvation, and summary killing as routine. The report made clear what the soldiers had seen, and it made equally clear that what they had seen was not the result of the chaos of retreating war. There were no Allied bombs responsible for these bodies. There was no artillery trajectory that explained the brass knuckles. What was documented at Ohrdruf on April 4, 1945 was a system, a deliberate, administered, bureaucratically organized system of killing people who were not soldiers, who could not fight back, who had committed no act of war, and who were protected by every standard of human decency that had ever been codified into law. The report reached General Patton within hours. What followed was not a procedural delay. The general did not set the report aside for further review. General George S. Patton, 59 years old, commander of the 3rd United States Army, received the initial account of Ohrdruf at his forward headquarters on the evening of April 4th. Patton was not a man given to sentimentality, and nobody who served under him mistook him for one. He was one of the most aggressive, least sentimental combat commanders the American military had ever produced. He had seen men die in every way that men can die in war, and he had sent them to it when he had to. He read the first report from the 89th, set it down, and read it again. He said nothing that anyone recorded at that specific moment. What he said later, in his diary, in his communications, in his testimony, was that the camp represented, in his words, one of the most appalling sights that I have ever seen. Not in the war, in his life. Patton made the decision to visit Ohrdruf personally. But before he did, he made a second decision that carried weight far beyond the tactical. He ordered that every American unit in the area not currently engaged in frontline combat was to be sent to the camp. Not a select group, not officers and correspondents. Every available soldier. He wanted his men to see it with their own eyes because he understood, in his deliberate and deliberating way, that there was a difference between knowing something had happened and standing inside the place where it happened and smelling the air. The former could be doubted. The latter could not. On April 12th, 8 days after liberation, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, flew to Ohrdruf. He was accompanied by Generals George S. Patton and Omar Bradley. A surviving prisoner who knew the camp's geography served as their guide through the site. That guide, it was later discovered, had himself been a collaborator with the SS during the camp's operation. He was recognized by another prisoner during the tour and beaten to death before American soldiers could intervene. Eisenhower, 54 years old, walked through every part of the camp that the guide showed him. He entered the rooms where the dead had been stacked. He examined the cremation pyre. He stood at the mass graves. He viewed the beating shed and the instruments that had been left inside it. Patton, who was present for all of this, vomited against the side of a building before they reached the shed, and refused to enter it. Eisenhower entered. He stood inside and did not look away. What Eisenhower said in the aftermath was not theatrical. It was the statement of a man who had processed something and arrived at a conclusion he intended to act on immediately. He cabled General George C. Marshall, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, that same day. The cable described, in the measured language of a five-star general who chose his words for the historical record, visual evidence and verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality so overpowering as to leave him physically sick. He noted that George Patton had refused to enter the shed. He noted that the evidence he had personally witnessed was such that it could not be dismissed as propaganda. He stated that he had made the visit deliberately. Those were his words, deliberately, so that if anyone in the future attempted to claim that the documented atrocities of the Third Reich were exaggeration or invention, there would exist in the record the first-hand testimony of the Supreme Allied Commander. That cable was not the end of the documentation. It was the beginning. Within days, Eisenhower cabled Marshall a second time. This cable was a request. He asked that a delegation of United States congressional leaders and prominent journalists be flown to the liberated camps so that they could see the evidence with their own eyes and bring it directly to the American public. He was specific. A dozen members of Congress, a dozen prominent editors, transported in C-54 aircraft. The Secretary of War, Henry Louis Stimson, received the request. President Harry S. Truman approved it. Within weeks, American legislators and journalists stood in the same soil where the prisoners of Ohrdruf had been worked to death and shot and left in open graves, and they brought the photographs, the testimony, and the documentary record home with them. German civilians from the town of Ohrdruf, men and women who had lived less than a mile from the camp fence, who had hired local workers to assist with the tunnel dynamiting, who had passed by on market days while 11,000 people starved behind wire, were ordered by American military authorities to walk through the camp and bury the dead. They came. They saw what was there. On the night following their tour, the Burgermeister of Ohrdruf and his wife were found dead in their home. They had hanged themselves. The documentation of Ohrdruf did not end with the war. American soldiers filed sworn testimonies in the months that followed. Photographs taken by men like John W. Beckett, a soldier in the 3rd Army's 734th Field Artillery Battalion who carried a camera through the camp on April 17, 1945, entered the evidentiary record. Beckett wrote about what he saw in his diary that night in a field transit book. The Polish prisoner who guided them with tears in his eyes, the beaten bodies, the graves, the instruments of torture, and concluded his entry with a single sentence. It was real, all too grotesquely real. He wrote a letter to his sister describing what he had seen and asked her to read it aloud at their community church back home. In 1991, Beckett donated his diaries and photographs to the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, where they remain part of the permanent record. Eisenhower's cable to Marshall became one of the most quoted documents of the Holocaust's evidentiary archive. His statement after leaving Ohrdruf, "We are told the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now at least we know what he is fighting against," was entered into the public record and has been cited in histories, monuments, and congressional testimony for 80 years. Joseph Simbley Jr. came home to Scranton, Pennsylvania. He married a woman named Geraldine. They had 5 children together. He worked as an artist and craftsman. He did not speak in detail about what he had seen at Ohrdruf for decades. Not to his children, not to friends, not in public. He kept his journals from the war stored away. He kept a pair of spiked brass knuckles he had found in the beating shed, and he kept them as a private relic of a private wound. It was only in 2019, the day after Geraldine's funeral, that Simbley pulled out his wartime writings and began to consider whether anyone would want to read them. His family asked whether he wanted the work published. He smiled and waved his hand. "No one would want to read my musings," he said. "Well, unless you think so, then please." He died in May 2021, at the age of 94. His account of that April morning in 1945 is now part of the documented record of the first Nazi concentration camp ever entered by American forces. The prisoners of Ohrdruf, the thousands who died in its tunnels and sheds, on its cremation pyres and in its mass graves, and on the roads leading north toward Buchenwald, were not soldiers. They had not chosen a side in the war. They had not taken up arms. They were French, Polish, Hungarian, Ukrainian, Jewish, German, and a dozen other nationalities, funneled into a camp in a valley in central Germany and worked until they broke, then killed when the men who built the system needed to erase the evidence of what the system had done. Most of them have no individual monument. Many of them have no known name in any archive. What they have is the record, the photographs, the testimonies, the cables, the diaries written in field transit books by young soldiers who knew they were witnessing something that had to be preserved. What they have is the fact that the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe walked into the place where they died